It's time to talk about Metroid Prime 4's sales. In the absence of hard data, what can we reasonably infer about where Metroid Prime 4 is at the moment, how it might compare to past Metroid and Metroid Prime titles, and to expectations? What is Nintendo's thought process right now, and what might the future hold for this series? Let's start with a quick recap. We know from producer Kensuke Tanabe's recent interviews that Metroid Prime 4 had long been requested by Nintendo of America. We know it released some mixed reviews on the 4th of December, 4 weeks before the end of the financial quarter. Nintendo's recent financial breakdowns has a threshold of 1 million sales for reporting purposes, but they seem to be reviewing the Nintendo Switch 2 editions and the Nintendo Switch edition separately. As a result, it is theoretically conceivable that Metroid Prime 4 could, in the 4 weeks to the end of the 31st of December 2025, have sold 1.9 million units with a perfectly even split, and therefore this wouldn't have been reported, but still would be a pretty decent start. However, let's look at the broader context. In November 2024, Nintendo reported that Metroid on Switch, that's both the Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime Remastered games, had sold 4.99 million in total up to that point. Since we know that Dread topped 3 million in sales, that means that Metroid Prime Remastered sold maybe 1.8 million in total, and if Dread's long-term numbers were decent, which in many ways I hope they were, then it could be that Remastered sold even less. Remastered, by the way, had rave reviews, was a new version of the Prime series' best-selling and most acclaimed entry, and was available for $40, despite being a graphical powerhouse, and that people were literally debating whether they could have actually called it a remake as opposed to a remaster. It also had a weird shadow drop, then physical release marketing strategy, which may well have hurt it, but arguably also encouraged a small number of mega fans to double dip, to play the game quickly, but also to have a physical item for collection. I'm sure that was a very small number of people, but it might have added up eventually. As for Metroid Prime 4, it was trailed for years ahead of time. It featured in all the Switch 2 preview events and presentations, and was released into the holiday season. Now, December is late in the season and not the most auspicious date, but games with traction selling through this period are not completely uncommon. Super Smash Bros. Ultimate sold 12.08 million on an install base roughly double Switch 2's. But obviously this is not a reliable comparison, it's Smash. So let's go back a year and check out Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Similar profile, long-awaited sequel to a beloved but niche original, but which received some negative feedback at launch due to aesthetic choice in the game. Arguably, mostly this response was in the West. I'm not sure if in Japan, where the main audience of the title was, there was such a controversy. Now that game reached 1.06 million on a slightly smaller install base by the end of its first month on sale, and of course it released in December as well. Now, if the same title were on the Nintendo Switch 2, it would have been split between two editions, and we would never have known about what it sold. As we know that from 2023, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 has sold more than 2.74 million copies, making it the strongest selling of all the Xenoblade games, perhaps not having this information for Metroid Prime is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. The Switch went on to have 2 ports and a full sequel to Xenoblade 2 during its lifespan. Xenoblade Chronicles 3, though in its first full fiscal year, released about a third of the way into the year it should be said, scooped 1.86 million, which is not really all that massive by comparison to many other Nintendo titles. Miyamoto has talked before in very rough terms about 2 million in sales being the baseline expectation, and while it's likely that Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has now crossed this, being a celebrated title in the series, it hadn't crossed it during a 7-month period at the height of the Switch. And that's Xenoblade Chronicles 3, which was a very high-profile game. What can we say about Metroid Prime 4, which has been somewhat more controversial? Now look, we'll examine more closely this comparison and its flaws, as well as its potential to give us insight later on, but first let's pivot back to Metroid Prime and that game's expectations. We know that in May 2023, Nintendo's first financial report after the release of Remastered said that it sold 1.09 million. We don't know exactly how Longtail Dread and how Longtail Prime sales square off, but given Metroid Prime Remastered only released in February digitally and March physically, it's plausible that after a few months on sale, it then reached the Xenoblade 3 numbers. Respectable. It's also possible that it didn't. Metroid Dread reportedly had 2.74 million units in its first 3 months, and in its first 15 months it reached 3.04 million, meaning that it shipped an extra 300,000 copies after its initial hype window, or about 10% of its long-term sales over the course of about 15 months. Now, Metroid Prime 4 released 2 months later in the quarter, and on a system that has a smaller current ownership, and so therefore where people may continue to pick it up as they buy the Switch 2 console. As a result, it seems likely that as of the 31st of December 2025, Metroid Prime 4 still could have had a big chunk of its sales trajectory to go. All that said, there's not much evidence that Metroid games have long tail sales like many of Nintendo's evergreens. All games have their biggest sales surge from month one, and with the Metroid games, it's very clear there is a dedicated fan base who goes in for them early, but there's not that much evidence of a long-term drip feed. In the case of Metroid Prime 4 as well, the game was available to Nintendo's largest install base ever if you include the original Nintendo Switch, as well of course as the new Switch 2 owners. Perhaps a few people who would be keen to play the game parked it until they could play it on Switch 2, but I suspect that that group is a minority. Tens, top whack hundreds of thousands, not millions. Most people who wanted to play it could play it, and I suspect even if they didn't have a Switch 2, a lot of them would have opted for the Switch version if it was something that interested them. Then again, we also need to consider the Switch and Switch 2 split in terms of inferring how much might have actually been sold, bearing in mind that Nintendo caps their reporting at 1 million units. And here things look a bit more optimistic for Metroid Prime 4. Pokemon Legends ZA had a 31% share of players on Switch 2, but that's a Pokemon title, a series that has historically hugged older hardware and is played often by younger children as opposed to the older players with disposable incomes who might want a Metroid Prime 4 title on Nintendo's most cutting-edge hardware offering. It seems perfectly plausible to me that Metroid Prime 4's numbers are higher, perhaps even at parity between the two models, perhaps even with a slight bias towards Switch 2 ownership. If the numbers were roughly equal, let's say 1.8 million sold in the first 4 weeks could be possible, that being 0.9 million for both, not at the reporting threshold, but still a decent amount. Even if the numbers were not equal, as long as one of the games was approaching a million, we could be looking at maybe 1.3 million, with perhaps 0.9 on one version and 0.4 on the other. So from here, we need to make some assumptions. Let's assume that a half to two-thirds of the people who were going to buy the game in the medium term would have already bought it by the end of 2025. That allows for people who didn't buy it before the holidays, but recognises that with this kind of game, many of the pre-orders were put in about 8 years ago, so it's not like it was a surprise when Metroid Prime 4 finally turned up. I'm not personally convinced that a huge number of people, let alone a majority of people who were keen to play the game, decided to wait a full 4 weeks, especially given that there is a narrative component to the game. I'm sure those people exist, some of them may be in the comments, but I just don't think this is going to be the majority. Therefore, we're probably looking at 2 to 3 million being the absolute most optimistic framing for where Metroid Prime 4 could end up, in the medium term at least. There's the potential for long-term sales, but as I say, I don't really see that being an option outside of some major intervention in the market, such as a film or some other kind of initiative. So that 2 to 3 million is top whack, but if true, the numbers aren't actually all that bad. It will be substantially ahead of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and in the ballpark of Metroid Dread, even if it doesn't quite reach the same numbers. However, there is another option here. If we take Metroid Prime Remastered's 1.8 million sale, very roughly, as the baseline level of interest for a Metroid Prime game, we might infer that by now around 2 million people have tried Metroid Prime in one of its forms, and they've likely had one of 3 different responses. Many would have loved it before, and now, well, they will still love it. Many more would have discovered it and fell in love with it, but a good number would have tried it and found it wasn't to their tastes. Now, if that's true of a significant number of people, that leaves just the core audience, and that's a decent number as far as we can tell. However, the core audience is also split. With Metroid Other M, I can find no reliable evidence that it even reached 1 million in sales, but if you believe VG charts, it may have done. Metroid Prime 3, if you include the trilogy re-release, hit 1.8 million, and probably, with the benefit of years since, is a cigarette paper's distance from 2 million in terms of total sales. A come down for a second game on a console isn't unusual with big popular titles like Mario and Zelda, but for your core audience title to have numbers like this suggests that Metroid fans are strongly willing to vote with their feet if the games don't meet their expectations. Samus Returns, which was broadly well received, never even reached 1 million sales in its first 6 months, and Federation Force, of course, vanished without a trace. While the baseline assumption would be that a new game would outperform a remaster, I just don't know that this is the case. If in May we still don't see numbers for either edition, we will know that the sales are probably capped at top whack what Metroid Prime 3's were, and that was on a console with a much higher install base at the time. I still think it's almost inconceivable that Metroid Prime 4 doesn't break 1 million in total, but the chance of it reaching, let alone exceeding 2 million, feels far less certain. And of course, if it doesn't reach the million threshold in this fiscal year, then we may never even know what Metroid Prime 4 has actually sold. Now, I don't agree that the game is necessarily a flop at this point, but the dream of it being a breakthrough seller feels very remote now. Okay, so far, so bleak. However, there are other considerations as well which might be more positive. Firstly, there was 3 amiibo launched alongside the game as well as an art book. All of these probably had pretty chunky profit margins for Nintendo. Now, I'm sure these were pretty low sellers, but even so, if they made a decent amount on them, it might have slightly ameliorated the low sales. Also, it still depends which kind of players are actually brought in. If Metroid Prime 4 is the first game played by a decent number of new Switch 2 owners, it may be seen to have served its purpose as an entry point game to the hardware, i.e., it's the kind of game that would get people to upgrade, as opposed perhaps to Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World, which might be seen as being more attractive to younger players. There's some evidence that Nintendo might see Metroid in this kind of role of converting people to new hardware. Yes, Metroid Dread was a great exemplification of the darks of the OLED, but I don't think they made it the launch game for the OLED just for the Metroid IP's health. If they had decent numbers suggesting that this different type of game brought in other kinds of players from those who would normally be buying a Switch, Metroid may have been credited with an outsized impact in the successful launch of the OLED, and so Nintendo might have thought that lightning would strike twice, and they could get some people who might not otherwise come over to Switch to buy the Switch 2 in order to play Metroid Prime 4. And then there's the Xenoblade comparison. Now, Monolith Soft, which got some negative press for extremely low entry-level wages a few years ago, and that's even by Japanese standards, is a very different matter from Retro Studios in Austin competing for the top development teams. I've estimated, back-of-the-envelope style, that Retro may cost Nintendo $25 million a year to keep going, and if we assume that there are a decent number of digital purchasers of Metroid Prime 4, then with 1 to 3 million sales being the kind of window we're looking at, we're probably expecting somewhere in the region of $40 to $150 million that game will make for Nintendo. I'd err in the middle and say that it's making 100 million gross. Nevertheless, Metroid Prime may have other value beyond just its gross revenue. Having a prestige American studio available to act as a nexus for top talent and a link to other Austin devs such as port specialist Panic Button, who of course worked on several of the Nintendo Switch 2 upgrades in the last year, may be of great use in diversifying Nintendo's output and building their links to the wider gaming community. Yes, the Austin developers are going to be significantly more expensive per person, but on the other hand, having assembled what by all accounts is a murderer's row of top talent, it only makes sense and is very much Nintendo's usual approach to these kinds of things to double down and keep supporting them to do what they're passionate about doing. After all, the design choice in the game came from Japan. Retro were working to a brief, and many of the things that they developed, such as the beautiful world of Fury Green, are among the more celebrated features of the game. I don't doubt for a second that Retro have top games in them for years to come, and I've long argued that it makes sense in many respects for them to move back to Donkey Kong Country after, especially with a Donkey Kong movie in the offing, and this would give them an opportunity to show a different string to their bow and perhaps have a more successfully received entry in their modern canon. The key question, though, is are they going to be given the teleporter keys to Metroid Prime 5 or even a Metroid Prime 2 remastered? Look, if second games on a console generally underperform the first, and with Echoes being less celebrated than the original Prime, we're looking at potentially only 1 million sales for such a game. Now, Xenoblade Chronicles X didn't clear 1 million as far as we know, though it also had its sales obscured by launching right at the end of a financial year, meaning it could have reached 1.9 million, but just under 1 million either side of the 1st of April 2025. Equally, I don't think for a second that Nintendo has to have each title individually make back its development costs. There is a place for planting seeds for the future. But when even top talent is involved and the game doesn't succeed after multiple attempts, well, just ask Star Fox or F-Zero fans what happens next. Star Fox on Wii U sold 500,000 copies reportedly on an install base that is pretty much the same as Switch 2's was when Metroid Prime released. That seems to be the point of commercial no return for Nintendo, and probably to a large degree because the fixed costs of producing a game are actually going to be much higher than they are even going to be able to clear with just 500,000 units sold of such a major title. My guess is that both a new version of Echoes and Metroid Prime 5 have a chance to make it in the coming decade, but each has a separate and rather narrow path in order to convince Nintendo that they would be good propositions. In the case of Echoes, creating a $40 or even $50 high-effort remaster feels to me like a complete non-starter at this point. They could certainly do something much more limited, like Pikmin 1 plus 2 if you will, but then it doesn't seem they'd be charging that much, and it might feel that they don't actually do the game justice, and so would it be just a bit of a Pyrrhic victory? If they did something on the scale of Remastered, though, it would be expensive. As a developer in a recent Kiwi Talks interview noted, in some respects it's harder than creating a flat-out original game, as design choices which were workarounds in the original needed to bodge something through now become fixed parts of the game and have to be, so to speak, retro-engineered. Then again, I do think the multiplayer functionality has great potential. Nintendo wants to focus on multiplayer with Game Chat, and with Federation Force they've tried with Metroid before, albeit very unsuccessfully. Multiplayer gaming is something Nintendo will want to continue to experiment with going forward, and they may think that taking a Metroid Prime game that already had a multiplayer component in it would be a way to try something new with the title without attracting the ire of fans to the same extent as if they just came out with a flat-out multiplayer Metroid. If they tacked on a plus game, therefore, Metroid Prime 2 plus Meet Up in Chozo Park, they could probably justify charging $70 or even $80, which might ameliorate the production costs a little, assuming that the audience were willing to meet the price. In theory, having already developed a lot of programming for Remastered and for 4, Prime 2 could be a less challenging proposition in some ways. I'm not a gaming developer, so I'm only speculating here, but if Retro could turn this around in record time, maybe just 2 or 3 years, it could break even if we assume that they are spending about 25 million a year in order to keep the studio going. But could the market support a third Metroid Prime game in such a short window? I just don't see any evidence that it could. Perhaps the core expectation by now probably should remain that Nintendo don't send good development capital after bad and decide to just let Metroid Prime 2 be a feature of Nintendo Switch Online. Now, that doesn't have to be a complete write-off of the game. I don't even think it's impossible to imagine that they could redo controls to include mouse mode and such like. We know, and I'm sorry for people who think I'm wishing this into existence, I'm really not, but I think we all need to get used to the reality that sooner or later there will be an increase in the price of Nintendo Switch Online, and probably with the expansion pack to boot. Now, more GameCube games is certainly an option in order to sweeten that pill, but what if they announced Metroid Prime 2 with new play controls, i.e. a more substantial upgrade than just bringing a game over, something that they could also do with a few other titles which have potential but might be better adapted for the new hardware using mouse controls and such like. Perhaps, for example, they could look at prior Star Fox games. Now, this could help bring in yearly subscriptions and would therefore likely be a better utilization of the game in their catalogue, although, of course, this would have difficulties too, and it would be quite time-consuming to make those adaptations. Time-consuming to the point where it might just be better to release it separately. As for Metroid Prime 5, it kind of depends on a few things. Could Retro turn around a budget Metroid Prime 5 in 3 or 4 years and have it look anywhere near as good as we've come to expect? Well, probably. They had a lot of problems on Metroid Prime 4, and despite its seemingly long development time, it appears that full production really ran from 2021 to 2025. Now they're up to speed, and if the game is designed around a more limited concept, it's possible. But the thing is, what's the pitch that would persuade Nintendo to go back again? Many would say that they just need to have a completely trad Metroid Prime, just to try and do the classic isolation-focused game in the best way possible. And to be clear, I'd love that, but I don't know how convincing I would find this in Nintendo's shoes. Prime Remastered was that game, and its sales were hardly anything to write home about. Metroid Dread in its way was ultra trad, but I think that's overlooking what Nintendo would see as the very novel edition of the Emmy robots. Because the Emmy worked so well, people overlook the fact that this is actually a fairly significant change to the pacing of a traditional Metroid, and it's at least as intrusive in its own way as the Federation Troopers in Beyond. It's just that it worked for most people. And actually, if you look at Fusion as having a bit of a prototype for it, that's very similar to the way that Metroid Prime 3 also kind of dipped its toe in having more speaking characters. Now, I do think Risa Tabata, the new series producer of Metroid Prime, gets the importance of isolation based on comments I covered in my previous video on the topic. If they can find a core mechanic that works with isolation, this could be a popular option. I don't even think it needs to be something massive for Nintendo to find it worth trying. For example, they've never got Shine Sparking to work as part of a first-person game. Is there a way they could incorporate this mechanic without making people feel motion sick? I definitely don't think they'll find it convincing to try to ape other Western game styles. They may have brought in people with first-person shooter experience, but they're always clear that Metroid is a first-person adventure game primarily. Also, while the games do have a place as system showcases for new technology, we could be years, maybe even a decade, from the next full generational leap, and mid-generation we can expect plenty of more assured showcase games like Zelda and Smash, so I'm not completely sure that Metroid Prime has a place for this purpose either. Fundamentally, I think they will need a pitch that feels convincing. It doesn't necessarily need to be a sure thing, but I think Nintendo do need to feel that they're at least taking a swing with a new Metroid Prime. One option, an option I have a hunch they might have been interested in prior to the release of Metroid Prime 4, would have been to do a multiplayer game recycling many of the assets of Beyond, but with the Federation Force. This possibly would have taken less time to create because they already had the overall structure of Buros, and so it would be a case of spending a lot of time developing and perfecting the multiplayer elements. Now, if that ever were a plan, I think that plan is almost certainly now dead, but if there were prototypes and if they were willing and able to cannibalize this into a Metroid Prime 2 Plus game, then this might make some sense as a next strategy, especially if they could put it out within 2 or 3 years. And of course, a lot of this is going to depend on their overall IP expansion efforts. If they can't find a way to make the Metroid IP work in another context, such as a film, then they may think it would make more sense to try and look at something else, to give Star Fox or Kid Icarus or something brand new a try. However, it's worth pointing out that this would have costs too. A well thought out Metroid Prime 5 with a 3-year development window and a, by the time it releases, normalized $80 price tag could conceivably break even with 1.5 million sales. Spending a couple of years prototyping something new before even starting development could be a much more expensive bet on a much more uncertain outcome. There is a cost to pivoting. At any rate, we will continue to see what new information comes out about Metroid Prime 4 sales. Please do check out the videos on screen, and thank you so much to the supporters of the Patreon, who are massively helpful in keeping this channel going. I shall see you next time, though, for another Nintendo Forecast.